Okay, guys, so we're gonna continue talking about the compliant INFJ a little bit. There's a reason why we need to talk about this INFJ, and you probably gathered that from my previous video on the topic, the video that must have been released yesterday, because it makes sense to have some continuity between these two videos that have essentially the same subject matter. The compliant INFJ is an INFJ that feels a lot of anxiety that impacts their well-being, impacts their quality of life, and this is something that they would like to put an end to, or at least significantly improve. But they're full of conflict, and that conflict is difficult to resolve because an adaptive mechanism is a mechanism that has become your own. It's kind of how you've learned to function. Imagine trying to unlearn that, and what are you going to do instead, right? And so if there is a value that I find in my work, and perhaps, with regards to these compliant INFJs, particularly in the Infinite Soul, my latest book on the INFJ Life in a Modern World, which I recommend you check out the link below. It's helped a lot of people. The compliant INFJ is an INFJ that is very common, that is in a sense symptomatic of our epoch's being out of sync with INFJ aspirations. So no wonder a lot of INFJs find refuge in these defensive modes of being, often, or in fact probably always, coupled with at least partly difficult childhoods. There's a crystallization of certain modes of being that are defensive, and for INFJs there's adaptation, adaptive submissiveness, which is the topic of today's video and yesterday's video, and there's also, on the other hand, solipsism, social withdrawal, which no doubt will be the subject of future videos, because there's still a lot to say about these INFJs as well, because they suffer just as much, even though their defensive patterns are quite different. There's a lot in common between these two types because they lean insecure existentially, but at the same time, they're really peculiar in their own way. And solipsists are a little bit less common than adaptives, but they're still quite common. Now, in the case of the compliant INFJ, like I was saying in my last video, they struggle with anxiety coming from intrapsychic conflicts. This is not so surprising because the anxiety comes from intrapsychic conflict. All right, I might as well just begin by saying this to clarify things once and for all, because a lot of people don't know this, and it's okay. I only really learned about this when I started my psychotherapy/psychoanalysis course, but this is an essential distinction to always have in mind. We don't want to imply that anxiety is the same as stress, and we don't want to imply that anxiety is the same as fear. So I think for a lot of people, it seems clear that anxiety is not the same as fear, but it's maybe a bit less clear that anxiety is not the same as stress. Or maybe people have an intuitive notion that they must be different, but actually how to quite tell them apart might not be so easy. So in very simple terms, I need to say this right off the bat, and then we can go back to our compliant INFJ and their anxiety. Fear has an external source. You're afraid of something, right? Something in the outside world is causing your fear. Stress, which at times can have symptomatic manifestations that are similar to that of anxiety, has an external source. If things are not going well at work, and they're not going well at work, this is stressful. Same if they're not going well in your intimate relationship, or maybe if you are living in a war-torn country, and there's lots of many ways you could be stressed. That's not anxiety. Anxiety has a cause, but it's internal, and it's so internal that the person can't quite pinpoint it. Okay. And so in a sense, you could take the vocabulary I'm using in my videos when I talk about the compliant INFJ and trying to explain the source of their anxiety. In a certain sense, it's a way of turning the anxiety into stress. And that might seem paradoxical. Why would I want to turn anxiety into stress for other people? Well, because in fact, stress is easier to deal with than anxiety. Because anxiety has guilt and sometimes shame in the package in a way that stress doesn't. Because when you feel this acute sense of pain and discomfort, existential pain and discomfort, but there's an external reason, it's not up to you. You're not the reason, and so there's absolutely no way you'd feel any guilt about it, right? And in a sense, that eases your time. Whereas if you feel acute existential discomfort and pain, and unpleasantness, and you can't put the finger on the cause, you're automatically going to assume it's internal. And so on top of all these pretty unpleasant feelings, you'd experience guilt. And it's also well known that the more guilt you experience, if the guilt becomes overwhelming, you fall into depression. Right? What distinguishes anxiety from depression is the level of guilt. And, you know, there's still guilt and anxiety. That's where it emerges, because the person has an intuitive sense that is coming from them. Intrapsychic conflict. So turning anxiety into stress is a good first step. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that the most anxious people are least anxious in situations where a lot of other people will be super anxious. Like in terrorist attacks, for example. There's been studies on this, because they can put a finger on where it comes from. So actually it eases their experience. It's very paradoxical, very fascinating. In any case, the compliant INFJ can be stressed. In fact, they wish they could be stressed instead of anxious, but they're mostly anxious because they can't put the finger on this intrapsychic conflict. It comes from deep inside. And this conflict is usually between their almost complete submission to introjective FE, that is to say, taking everything that the group expects from them, or that they feel the group expects from them, making it their own and manifesting it, and their impossible to extinguish desire for autonomy, which is contained within this NI that they repress, but by repressing it, they're not making it disappear. So they're living a counterflow experience. You know, you could say like the INFJ, when they're compliant, are counterflow people. You know, they dam it up. They erect all kinds of obstacles, walls. They do all they can to try to obstruct the natural course of the NI river. And that manifests as anxiety. What is one of the most common ways they manifest this in everyday life, and how come they're actually not aware? This is a subconscious and usually even unconscious process. So much so that, indeed, the source of the anxiety is not directly understood. You know, you need to familiarize yourself with the defense mechanism that I have mentioned before, but without really pausing to take a deep look at it. I've talked about intellectualization, I've talked about moralization, and I have talked about isolation of affect. Right? I've talked about these defense mechanisms, and you do find that in, you know, all INFJs, more often in insecure INFJs, but everyone uses these to some extent. But I have mentioned before the defense called reaction formation. And reaction formation is possibly the defining defense mechanisms that governs and tyrannizes over compliant INFJ experience. So to become aware of it is already a great first step. Yes, compliant INFJs use reaction formation all the time. What is reaction formation? It's a psychic process, a psychic defense mechanism, whereby the INFJ takes a particular situation that makes them feel a certain way and responds by transmuting it into the exact opposite expression of affect. So it's like they feel an emotion, but the affect, instead of expressing the emotion that they're feeling, expresses the opposite emotion. So you'd be enraged at someone, you feel the rage, and yet the affect you express is like friendliness or gratitude. You know, it's you feel like deeply disappointed, but the affect that you express is recognition or you know, kindness, things like that. So the reaction formation is typical of people who don't trust their feelings, and particularly don't trust that the expression of their real feelings will be harmless. That is to say, they don't trust that the expression of their real feelings will reinforce them in a group. They tend to fear the expression of their real feelings as an almost certain cause of their getting excluded from the group. So they're terrified of the idea of expressing those emotions. The compliant INFJs do this all the time, and no wonder. You know, if their absolute goal is inclusion, adaptation, belonging, anyone from the group might tell them something that they really don't agree with, and sometimes makes them angry. And there's no way they're going to express that. Because they're so afraid of being excluded. So they'll say, yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, that's very interesting. It gets me thinking. Right? Typical INFJ behavior of the compliant type, very typical. You notice it all the time, all day long. Typical reaction formation. That's the conflict. Because it means that the emotion, you're not liberating it through affect, you're not expressing it, so the emotion stays in. If it's rage, if it's anger, if it's disappointment, it stays in, right? You're repressing this thing, and it's like this pulsating kind of ball of psychic power has not found an outlet, staying in there, and it's pushing up and causing you more anxiety. Like, reaction formation is not as non-costly. That's always a nice double negation. I'll say it differently. A reaction formation as a defense is more costly than people think, particularly if you're using it all the time. So to become aware of it, that you're doing this, and that you don't need to do this, that in fact, linking the emotion and the affect, that is to say, linking the emotion and the expression of the emotion, shows that you're going to not be afraid of other people's reaction to your sincere expression of emotion, that you have enough ego strength to face the possibility of any reaction, and so of course to some extent boost your self-esteem. But you have to start now. Be careful of this phenomenon of reaction formation. It is very, very common. Okay guys, another book that this is the end of the video, but I want to mention that Ecstatic Soul, the Ecstatic Soul, my first book on the INFJ, a new look at the INFJ personality, is of course still available at the link below, together with the Infinite Soul, which I presented earlier and of which it is the prequel, and that's the deepest investigation of the INFJ mind that you will find online. What's it like to think like an INFJ and to be an INFJ? Nothing goes further, and it's helped a lot of people. And finally guys, as usual, don't forget that I have a YouTube, a Patreon page. You already know I have a YouTube channel, I believe, but I have a Patreon page. I could not do it without you. I need all the help I can get to keep the channel going. So please consider supporting me. It's not expensive. The link is right below to my Patreon. You get access to some cool perks now. You know, we have the Fourfold, which is our Discord server. It's brand new and it's already full of interesting discussions, interesting people. You can interact with me there, and you get access to bonus video content every 2 weeks coming from me, in-depth discussions of a topic of your choosing, and other perks too. So hopefully see you there, and I'll talk to you next time, guys. Bye-bye.